So Ryan, let's talk about the sort of the more generic. Let's start with the more generic um, uh, disastrous policies of the Obama administration as to how it related to um, those homeowners who were in distress in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Let's talk about those things that Obama did and didn't work out well or didn't do well before we get to the specific implications for black wealth and black home ownership in the country. So take us back to following the 2008 collapse. Barack Obama is the president. He's not even the president-elect that, but ultimately he is. That's where he obviously has some authority. And it goes from there. I mean, his earliest decisions, even I think before he became president, were problematic.
Yeah, actually, he was involved with the negotiations because, Democrats were passing this huge bailout because Democrats had the House at least in 2008, and they had their eye on probably winning the presidency. So one of the things they did with the TARP bailout bill, Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, was they gave the president a huge legal latitude and a big appropriation, which wasn't even specified, basically a huge slush fund to help homeowners who are in distress, with the eye that, Obama is going to be it, and so we're going to give him a ton of authority to deal with this. It's sort of the explicit, justification was that, banks are getting all this massive free money, so, homeowners should get a piece of that too. And basically, we can get into the details, but I think the fundamental thing was that housing prices declined a lot, and there were a ton of assets that had been made out of home mortgages. And so when, there's a big bubble pops, then the question is, who's going to take the hit? Who's going to eat the loss? And the banks were bailed out. All their losses, they were mostly made whole by the government, by ultimately, the taxpayers, and the state structure created by, the citizenry. But homeowners just ate the losses. For the most part, those are the people that took the hit. It was homeowners on both sides.
I just want to map this out for folks because, and just we can go a little bit further into the weeds insofar as we had all these home mortgages. They were then they were issued by a servicer who is basically, in charge, or I should say an originator.
Yeah.
And the originator could be a bank or may have been just a service. They then sold it to another bank. And then that bank would have taken it and divvied up these different mortgages and put them into investment vehicles. This is what is known as financial innovation. And these things became derivatives. And each time you get further away from the underlying asset, it's a derivative. And it basically becomes a series of side bets. And when these side bets failed, essentially, because it was incredibly complicated, some of these side bets were actually insurance that the other side bet wouldn't fail. And when these side bets failed, because the standards for these originators in terms of who they were giving mortgages to and under what conditions, they were making bad loans. And there were so many bad loans that the financial system collapsed. And when the financial system collapsed, it completely undercut home value. So people who had bought a home for $100,000, let's say, suddenly, and they took out a mortgage for $90,000, they put 10% down, they find their house worth $50,000. So even if they were to turn around and sell it, they would owe money once they sold this home, and so they were stuck. And so the question was, how do we bail? How do we help the system? And the Obama administration took that money and gave it to the banks with the idea that the banks would be nice and let the homeowners off the hook, help the homeowners in some way. And let me just remind people, Barney Frank has been saying for years that he was told by Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary at that time, that I'm happy to give the money directly to homeowners, but Barack Obama has to sign off on it. Barack Obama was the president-elect, and when Barney Frank went to Barack Obama, Obama said, well, we only have one president at a time, and Barney Frank claims that he said, well, frankly, we don't have any presidents right now. And so that was the sort of the first decision. Which way are we going to deal with this problem? We can give it directly to the homeowners, and they can pay the banks. Or we can give the money and cover the losses for the banks and hope, because there was no mechanism to force the banks to give relief to homeowners. Okay, so that was the first thing. That's TARP. What was the next thing that they did?
Yeah, the next thing is when they set up the supposedly home mortgage, foreclosure relief program, and that was called the Home Assistance Mortgage Program, I think, or HAMP. And they basically, as you were saying, with the bailout money, they gave that money to the banks, and they even nationalized some institutions like AIG, the biggest insurer in the world. But when they started to do, when the Obama people's administration set up a foreclosure relief package, they allocated $75 billion, $50 billion from the bailout money, and 25 from Fannie and Freddie. And they gave that money to the mortgage servicers instead of to the homeowners again. And the servicers are, sometimes parts of these banks, but they're just the sort of accounts receivable department, because as you say, these mortgages are often owned by weird investors all over the globe, and so they hire servicers to handle the paperwork. But the problem with paying the servicers to do loan modifications, supposedly, is that the servicers have a direct monetary incentive not to do loan modifications. Because, as you say, if you're like a underwater homeowner, if you owe more on your house than it's worth, then probably the best thing that can be done for you is a principal reduction, to say, like, we're going to cut whatever you owe down to the, actual value of the home, so that you're not underwater anymore.
And we should say, this is something that happens in bankruptcies all the time. And in fact, there was a bankruptcy bill in the summer of 2009 where Barack Obama had promised to include a cram down provision. And this is a term of a common term in the context of bankruptcies, where the principal is reduced to basically, everybody says, because banks have a fiduciary responsibility to loan responsibly. That's why we have bank regulators. That's why there's board of directors who oversee loan officers. That's why they're called officers, for gosh sakes. Yeah. And when they make a bad loan, everybody takes a haircut, and the principal is pushed down, and that's a cram down. And that, of course, there was no incentive for servicers to do a cram down, because they get paid based upon the principal. Yeah,
and then they get paid with fees, and they even have an incentive to foreclose in many cases, because they get paid due to how the servicer contracts are written. They get paid from the proceeds of the foreclosure sale before anybody else, before the investors who own the loan anyways. And it resulted in this crazy situation where they, the servicers were blatantly abusing the program. They were tricking people into foreclosure. It probably made things worse on net, but the Treasury Department didn't investigate really any of the abuses. Neither did the Justice Department, and they didn't even claw back their payments permanently. Like, they took back some for the most outrageous scams they had been running, but they eventually gave them back whenever they had supposedly made some reforms. But the whole thing was just an epic botch. And the reason it was an epic botch was because the administration did not want to help homeowners. Neil Barofsky was in the room where Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner told Elizabeth Warren that the whole point of this foreclosure program was to foam the runway, his words, foam the runway for the banks.
In other words, a
they're-
soft landing for the banks, and however they could achieve that, that was the first and last goal. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the now that we've established the Obama administration had banks in mind, let's talk about who suffered the most severe, deepest consequences of this failure of the Obama administration to deal with this in a proper way. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Ryan Cooper on how Barack Obama destroyed black wealth. We'll be right back.